building one of those spheres for those residencies in Nashville right now.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
That it makes too much sense not to have
Where at?
Nashville.
Oh yeah, that makes
It makes a lot of sense. We'll see if that.
Just get a football team that knew how to play.
Yeah, that would help. That would help fill up the new stadium they're spending $2.1 billion on. I can't mention how much they're spending around some of my family back home because they get a little tense.
Oh, they do.
$2.1 billion on the stadium for a football team? Yes, but the Super Bowl.
It's a good investment.
It's going to bring the Super Bowl in 2030. I think, honestly, I think...
Or you could take $10 billion and buy a basketball team so that 10 way overpriced basketball players can run up and down the court.
Well, it'd be 12. Only
Oh,
10 of them
12.
would play.
Yeah.
Your point's not lost.
I would love to see the revenue of an NBA team compared to an NFL team because they're both going for about the same price right now. And yet the average NFL team last I looked was somewhere around $750 million annually in revenue. So that imputes about a 10 to 15x multiple.
Yeah, but you got 40 games plus playoffs
Yeah.
in the for basketball, and your tickets are not any cheaper.
No.
Your stadium's smaller, but your tickets are more
Yeah,
expensive.
and so like there's so many so the revenue point of view. So who has the revenue? Who versus the net worth or the value of the franchise? That would be a really interesting study if I could get a hold of
Well,
it.
everybody's doing the financials, but there's way too many variables and assumptions that are made, I think, in
Yeah.
both directions.
Yeah.
For
Okay,
sure.
guys, we are going to get started in the book of Exodus before I get too far gone talking about stadiums and infrastructure and sports franchises because that's just fun stuff for me. So we are going to start in Exodus chapter 1. It's a very good place to start. But as we get started in this new book,
Hey, before you get started,
Yeah.
did you want to mention Kirkland on Saturday?
Yeah.
Todd had mentioned that. Just that they from 6 to 7:30 they're having that
Yeah.
singing. If anybody can make it, he texted Steve and I and asked us
Yeah.
to mention that at tonight's Bible
Sure.
class.
yeah, so if you didn't hear Chris, Kirkland's having a singing Saturday night, 6 to 7:30 at the Kirkland Church of Christ building, if you can make it. So we are in Exodus, kind of continuing our study that we started in the first quarter in the book of Genesis. We're continuing now in the second book of the Old Testament, there in the book of Exodus. And so when you think about the book of Exodus, in the Exodus story, why is the Exodus story so important today? What makes the Exodus story important for us? After all, this probably happened 3,500 years ago.
If God can lead his people out of that kind of captivity, we suppose he can take care of us with our knuckleheads in the world today doing thoughtless things.
If God can lead them out of Egyptian bondage, he can take care of us today, even with the knuckleheads that maybe we're surrounded by. Even when we're the knucklehead, yes, perhaps. What else? Why else is the Exodus story so important today?
This is separating his people. This is taking you're my special people.
Mm-hmm.
You're devoted to me, and I'm devoted to you. Not that I'm not the God and King of all,
Yeah.
but you are the people who are special to me and make that promise. And it reminded me of, I'm blanking on it, but it's somewhere I'm trying to think of it in Leviticus, which I'm reading right now. It was talking about that. Don't be like the other people.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be like the people in Egypt. Don't be like the people in Canaan. You're my people.
Yeah.
And that's important. So there's the Exodus is that setting apart, which then has huge implications for his perspective on his called out
Yeah.
in the church.
Yeah, so it's a reminder. It's God saying, you are my people. That is a huge theme. In fact, if you really look at the structure of Exodus, the first 18 or 19 chapters, everybody divides the story or the book of Exodus a little differently. But if you look at the first 18 or so chapters, it's redemption, going back to what Steve said a moment ago, that if God can redeem them, he can take care of us. And then you have God speaking there in verses 19 through 24 and saying, this is what it looks like to be my people. Here are the covenantal obligations to be my people, and elaborated even further as Chris talked about there in the book of Leviticus. And then verse 20 or chapter 25 through 40 is what it takes or what it requires to dwell with God. And then at the end of the book, God comes down and dwells. And we'll talk about some of these themes continually throughout the book of Exodus. And so it's a story about redemption, which touches us. It's a story about being God's people. Are there any other reasons why the book of Exodus would be important for us? Yeah.
Well, it sure seems to me that if you have embraced the Bible as cover to cover the story of the gospel, the story of the Savior, the story of God's plan to save his people for all times, if Exodus doesn't happen, that story's got a hole in it.
Yeah.
And there is no hole in it. Everything is happening at God's direct oversight.
Mm-hmm.
That he's leading his people out of there because of everything else that has to happen
Yeah.
in order for the Savior.
Mm-hmm. So I want to tie a couple of thoughts. What were you going to say, Ray?
Only that, I think that, if we didn't have the Exodus, we wouldn't have the law. And the law is something that we need to in order to fulfill what
Yeah,
Jesus is
good
going to do.
Yeah.
Good point.
Also, I think that there's a purpose there.
Yeah.
For example, he wanted to punish all those people in Canaan and all those guys, and he was going to wipe them out. So that's how he's going to do it. And that's going to show the whole world how great the God is that we need.
Okay. There's a
Example,
lot.
That's a
there's-
thought.
No, I think you're spot on, especially the last part in terms of how great God is. So I'm going to try and tie some of these ideas together. A moment ago, Chris used the word promise. That is part of the book of Exodus. If we recall, going all the way back to Abraham there in Genesis chapter 12, when God makes this promise to Abraham. And that promise is repeated in different forms in Exodus 15 and Exodus 17. And finally, here in Exodus, let's say Exodus 15 and Exodus 17, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17. It's repeated 3 different times, at least in Abraham's life, that your children are going to become a great nation, and they're going to come back here. And so Exodus is how that happens. Exodus is how they're redeemed. And also what Ray said just a moment ago about the world knowing that he is God. That is something we're going to see really, really frequent, that phrase of this, so that the world may know, or so that Pharaoh may know that I am God. That is really going to come to the surface, especially from like Exodus 7 through about 12.
Yeah, the other thing is you have a pivotal moment at the end of Genesis where they're saved from the famine, they're given their own land, and they're allowed to prosper. And that same period of time is about the same amount of time as after the return to Jerusalem after the captivity and the time of Rome and Jesus coming. Those 2 segments are about the same time. And
Yeah.
so there's some parallels, I think. And we often talk about, the sort of the silence of
Yeah.
God during that time. But the fact is, we don't know what happened in those 450 years. I mean, we have no idea how active God was other than his providence.
Yeah. There's a lot. That is an interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up, that there's 400-ish years between Genesis 50 and Exodus 1. There's 400-ish years between Malachi chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 1. It is so important today. Exodus is central to the story of God. The way I was talking with some friends about this today, texting them, I think Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of like the operating system of the Bible. It is like the foundation. If you can think about a computer, it's the foundation. You can't run a computer without an operating system. Every computer's got an operating system, right? But Exodus is almost like the interface. It's how you see the operating system in your life. And so Exodus is central to the story for a lot of reasons, because the Exodus becomes a template or a prototype or a paradigm or whatever word you want to sub in there for how God delivers his people. If we look ahead into the New Testament, put our New Testament thinking caps on, like one of the things we're going to see if we were to go to the New Testament is these images of the Exodus are used there. And even to Chris's point a moment ago, the Exodus idea, the Exodus image is repeated there in, Steve's going to love this, Isaiah, as a promise of the return from exile. And even the return from exile is described in Ezra and Nehemiah in almost Exodus language. What were you going to say? I saw your hand pop up a second ago.
Well, they're the children of Israel, Abraham, we're spiritually tied back to Abraham.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is a physical thing. They go into bondage for 400 years and then they're God's special people. He brings them out. So he tells a physical, real story
Yeah.
about our spiritual walk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a sense, we're much more Israelites or Jewish than the Jewish people. They're Jewish physically or
Yeah.
their DNA.
Yeah.
I want to be spiritually,
Yeah.
tie my faith all the way back to Abraham and God's story. So there's a physical story. But the story of Randy Bass and his relationship with God is a spiritual story through my faith
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that takes me to the real promised land
Mm-hmm.
that lasts forever.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, no, I think you got a good point there in terms of the physical and the spiritual, and the technical term there is typology, and how these images are repeated and reused throughout the biblical story, and anticipate and look forward to, as you pointed to, the promised land. Their physical promised land anticipates in some ways our spiritual promised land. Chris?
This is a proclamation to the world, much in the same way that with Jesus it was a proclamation to the world, that the Jews he had been with the Jews those 450 years. This is after his statement in earlier in Genesis was, I'm going to get rid of all of you. Noah and his family stayed and we built it back up.
Yeah.
His proclamation now is, this is what you are to be a light to the nations. And you can't do that being part of, in any way, shape, or form, that also, I mean, they were oppressed, they were in slavery, so the dynamics had changed. But it is a statement. From this point forward, the Jews are going to be distinct.
Yes. And keep that idea. I wish we had time to dig into that idea of being a light to the nations and how that image is used in various ways in the Old Testament. Because, as Chris has pointed out, Israel was called to be a distinct people. The language that Exodus uses in Exodus 19 is to be a kingdom of priests, a holy people for his own possession. And that has implications there in Exodus 19, and really more specifically 20 through 24, on how that was going to be demonstrated in their life. And so here in Exodus chapter 1 opens there by looking back at the book of Genesis, particularly Genesis chapter 46 through 50, by reminding us of a couple of names that came down to Egypt with Israel. And it reminds us, like we talked about last week, that there were 70 people who came down, and we connected 70 in that theme to the rest of the Bible, and how we see 70 elders and 70 men sent out there and the Gospels. But Joseph and his brothers and all that generation eventually died. Now here's a kind of a cool historical note, that Joseph and his family probably came down during the famine, during a wider group of Semitic peoples. They're called the Hyksos, or various peoples who migrated to Egypt around 1800 BC, 1700 BC. And what happened during that time frame, or as a result, is the native Egyptians, this is important for the Exodus story, this is why I'm saying, the native Egyptians were actually outed from the throne. And Semitic people took control of Egypt. And so for a couple of hundred years, you had Semitic people reigning over Egypt. But I want to say it was like 1600 or so BC. The exact date is I'm blanking on. But around 1600 or so BC, those Semitic peoples were conquered, and a native Egyptian took control of the throne. And so keep that in mind, because Joseph and his generation died, and while even though they've died, verse 7 says, they were fruitful, they increased rapidly, they multiplied, and they became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. What was God's intention for man in Genesis 1 and 2? To be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. What is Israel doing there in Egypt? Being fruitful and multiply and filling the earth. And yet there a new king there in verse 8 who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So from a political perspective, this new king, a native Egyptian, is going, these Semitic peoples, these Israelites are a threat. We've already dealt with them once. They've already conquered us once. They've already taken control of Egypt once. We can't let that happen again. So we have got to nip this in the bud, as Barney Fife used to say. And so I actually answered the next question. What changes from Genesis to Exodus 1? Well, Joseph is dead, and there's a new Pharaoh on the throne, and that new Pharaoh doesn't like the Jews. Yes?
And part of this is human nature. I mean, if we go back 150 years, we still have some referential stuff to things that are applicable today.
Yeah.
If you go back to the time of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and that, you go, and you got Washington as kind of an anchor, but other than that, in between, there's a whole mix of different people that Declaration of Independence, all that stuff, but nothing is concrete anymore that's there. So it shouldn't be shocking to us that 450 years later, there's somebody on the throne, Pharaoh, who doesn't regard Joseph.
I'm going to put it this way. Does the name Millard, to your point, does the name Millard Fillmore mean anything to anybody in here? Do you recognize that name? What about this name? Peyton Randolph. Have you ever heard the name Peyton Randolph in your life? Okay, Peyton Randolph was the first president of the Continental Congress. So, and you can Google the Randolph family. Cool family to learn about, by the way. But so no one thinks about Peyton Randolph today. 250 years ago, he's already forgotten. A lot can change in 250 years. A lot can change in 450 years, including who's in control and how Joseph and his family are perceived. And what's interesting is, even though Joseph and his family are no longer regarded highly, what he did for Egypt, what he did for people 450 years early has been forgotten. Israel's still growing. Israel's still being multiplied. God is still blessing them. And what we see there in the text is this new king who is possibly named Amos. Amos the first is believed by some to be the Exodus mentioned here, the Pharaoh mentioned here in Exodus 1. And that is a picture of his mummy there on the screen. And so he comes up with this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to curse. We are going to oppress Israel. And so I draw our minds back to Genesis chapter 12. What was that promise to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12? That I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. What we're about to find out over the next several chapters is what happens when people try to curse, or more specifically, oppress God's people. And so Amos expelled the Hyksos, Amos expelled the Jews, Amos is doing all these things to make life miserable for them. And yet, verse 12, they continue to multiply there in the text. No matter what he does, the Hebrews, the Jews, the Israelites continue to multiply. And just a couple of things that kind of jumped out as I was reading. I want to look at the words that are used to describe the situation for the Jewish people. Verse 11, that they were oppressed, that they were worked ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter. Several times there in the text, the situation there is described, and it is not a pleasant one. And every time the Pharaoh tries to nip it in the bud, to make life miserable, to try to crush Israel, it comes back on him. And so really I want to think about this question from the second half of Exodus 1. How does Pharaoh try to control or crush Israel in Exodus chapter 1? How does he try to control Israel? First thing we just talked about a minute ago, he tries to oppress them, hard work. What's the other two? He does three specific things. Kill the babies, and there's just the baby boys. They're starting there in verse 18. When the babies come out, and if it's a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, you can let it live. But verse 17, the midwives feared God, and they let the boys live. And so the king of Egypt gets mad, and why have you done this and let the boys live? He's confused. He's befuddled. Verse 19 is kind of funny to me, because it says, the midwives replied to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them.
One translation says sturdy.
Sturdy. Yeah. What translation says that?
Is it the ESV? Maybe the ESV, but I've read it in at least one.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's really a compliment that that these women are vigorous in doing what's right,
Yes.
and that's
Yeah.
what I take it.
They do what's right, and so God is good to the midwives, and he gave them families as well. And so that 3 times there in Exodus chapter 1, it tells us that Israel is fruitful, and they're multiplied, and they're growing. And so we have this battle, this contrast here in the text between Pharaoh and the midwives. Does anything about this contrast between Pharaoh and the midwives, especially in the context of a world 3,500 years ago, jump out to you? Does anything about that contrast there in Exodus chapter 1 jump out to you? Look specifically at verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name was Shiphrah and the second was Puah. Do we know the name of the Pharaoh? Does the Bible tell us that name? No. But we know the names of the midwives. We are left 3,500 years later to guess and make some educated guesses on who the Pharaoh of the Exodus may be. He is unknown. But these 2 women of faith who take a stand for what is right are recorded. That's just really interesting to me. Because Pharaoh is the most important, most powerful man in the ancient world. And he is nameless. He is insignificant in the eyes of God in this story. But these women aren't. Any thoughts or comments or questions that you guys see there in Exodus chapter 1? Yeah.
In 19, I kind of come back to, I feel like I am picking up on more and more fibbing, I guess, in the Bible. And this feels a little bit in that category too.
Yeah.
And it just, it doesn't sit right with me all the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I suppose they could take the wrong path to get to the house, so maybe they never did arrive.
Yeah.
But do we think that's true? Do we think that they did arrive and they just are telling him something? It's
I think you bring up a great point there for a lot of different reasons. Because what's the initial command that Pharaoh gives? If the child is a son, kill it. They're getting to the house, and by that time the boy is born. If they were obedient to the command, it doesn't matter if the Hebrew child has been born or if he's still, in the process of coming out, the mom's still in labor. They're still there. They see the baby. So I think this is an obvious, to your point, Scott, I think this is a great point to bring out. In my opinion, I think this is just another excuse that these midwives are making, a fib, to use your terminology, to kind of push back on Pharaoh, that they're not going to do what Pharaoh wants them to do because they realize that's not what God would want them to do. That's a great catch. Yeah.
I find it interesting that it's only 2 midwives for
Yeah.
this huge
Yeah.
populace, this huge
Yeah.
group of people. I don't know,
Yeah.
I find that interesting. There's only 2 to the multitude.
So,
of
to
prophets.
your point, Desiree, when we find out the census of Israel here in a not too distant future, there's 600-something thousand that come out. 600,000 men. If you include a wife and 2 kids and a white picket fence for each kid, for each man, then you're looking at 6 times 4. You're looking at 2.4 million people. No wonder they're busy. No wonder they're late. Some people have suggested, to that point, Desiree, that these 2 midwives are kind of like the chief midwives.
Right.
So throw that out there as a suggestion. I'm not sure the text explicitly says that, but as you wrestle with how in the world do 2 women deal with the births of 600,000 women? Like, that would keep most hospitals in Seattle pretty busy. Keep them in business. And so how do 2 women do it? And so I think there's plausible reason to think here that these may be like the chief midwives. And Pharaoh's dealing with those midwives face to face, these as leaders of the midwives there. And so Exodus chapter 1. Any thoughts, comments, questions here in Exodus chapter 1? And so what we see here in Exodus chapter 1 is really another contrast, a struggle between a king in Pharaoh who wants to eliminate or destroy God's people, and another king in God who is intent on preserving or saving his people. And just one quick note that I think will help us, and I want us to pay attention to as we work our way through the book of Exodus. There in verse 13, you see the phrase, my Bible says worked. Does anybody else's Bible say anything else? They worked the Israelites ruthlessly. Anything else? So you see this word in the Hebrew pop up, I think 100 times in the book of Exodus, or around 100 times. You see it in 13. You see it in verse 14 3 times. You're going to see it at the end of chapter 2 times. This book is filled with references to that word, labor or work. And it kind of serves as an interesting contrast of something we're going to see as the story continues to develop. Between a Pharaoh who works Israel ruthlessly and a God who wants Israel to serve him with their heart. It's the same word throughout the book. Serve God, serve Pharaoh. What will Israel do? And that's one of those underlying themes that we see here in the book of Exodus. And so the story continues that a man, in chapter 2 and verse 1, from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. And the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket. Does anybody else have a different translation?
Bulrushes?
Bulrushes. Okay, anything else? Anybody have ark? Anything besides basket? Okay, keep this in mind. We're going to unpack this here in a second. Papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. And she placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Okay. So the word translated there, basket, is the same word translated ark in Genesis 6 through 9. So think about what we're seeing here. Noah, in Genesis 6 through 9, built an ark, covered it with pitch, and floated over the water, and was saved and was redeemed. Moses was put in his ark that was covered with pitch, placed in the water, and was saved. Interesting parallels between their story. And so Moses is placed in the water, and Moses' sister stood at a distance. By the way, pause here for this. This is really cool. Ahmose, the first king in the 18th dynasty of Egypt. What's interesting about a lot of those kings in the 18th dynasty? M-O-S-E. A lot of the kings in the 18th dynasty have M-O-S-E in their name. It's interesting because if Ahmose in the Exodus does take place during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and I think there's a lot of reasons to do that, to place it then, it would make sense that Moses would be named Moses, because that's a common name during that time frame for people in the Egyptian royal house. So Moses grows up. He's seen by his sister in the water, but Pharaoh's daughter goes down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. I got to think they're looking for crocodiles, but that's just me. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girls, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child, and there he was, a little boy crying. And she felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, this is interesting, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing it to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." She ends up getting paid to nurse her own son. Kind of interesting. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." That is Hatshepsut. That is possibly the daughter of Exodus 2. I say possibly because a lot of this we don't know. We're looking at archaeology, we're looking at history, we're trying to line it up. But I thought I'd like to put a face to a name. And I thought what better to help us put a face to a name than a mummy. But that kind of helps us see who we're dealing with, potentially who we're dealing with here in the text. Does anything about Moses' upbringing jump out to you there in the text? Does anything strike you? So far, we are 32 verses into the book of Exodus. And from a human perspective, who are the major characters? Who are the good guys? Who are the people making a real impact?
Midwives?
Women.
The midwives?
The midwives, women. I think by this point in time, we've met like 5 or 6 women. Who's the bad guy? Pharaoh. It's a dude. It's really interesting to see that kind of come to the surface here in the Exodus story, that the bad dude is a guy, and these women are doing what is right here in the story, and how God is almost providentially providing a way for Moses to be saved. I just think that this whole story, especially the first 10 verses of chapter 2, are just so ironic, because Moses is going to be raised in Pharaoh's house. He's going to potentially be raised alongside the Pharaoh of the plagues. That he's either a effective cousin, a brother, a stepbrother. There is some form of, they're growing up together. They know each other. And that's going to play a role, I hope, in how we visualize the story, especially as we get to the plagues. Because Moses is not going into someone he doesn't know. Moses is probably talking to someone he knows and probably cares for very deeply. But Moses' life was not smooth. That even though he was raised in Pharaoh's house and educated in all the ways of the Egyptians and had access to everything that would come with living the royal life in Egypt, he still wanted to be with his people. And when he did, he observed, verse 11, their forced labor, and an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. And so looking around, and so let's ask this question really quickly. How does Moses respond to injustice here in Exodus 2? He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and here in a minute, we're going to see Moses seeing Hebrews fight each other. So how does Moses respond? Violently. Yeah. The first time, verse 12, he struck the Egyptian dead. The second time, verse 14, who made you a commander? He asks the question in verse 13, why are you attacking your neighbor? And they respond, who made you a commander and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Moses became afraid. But Moses responds to the injustice and the iniquity that he sees before him, and he speaks out. A lot of people think that Moses has some understanding in his mind that he is going to be the guy who rescues Israel. That he is going to be the guy who redeems Israel, who brings Israel out of Egypt and toward the promised land. A lot of people believe at this point in his life he does, and that he's taking it on his own time. That he's trying to serve as a redeemer before it is God's time to be a redeemer. The text does not explicitly say that, but a lot of people believe that's what's going on.
I think it's a huge leap. I can't. I think he knows he's a Hebrew.
Yeah.
So he grew up knowing that because his mother was with him.
Yeah.
And so he saw saw what they were doing to his people.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm sure they're saying, well, his people, because he's knows he's going to be the redeemer. I just don't.
Yeah.
I just don't buy it, because what he does is he buries that body in the sand and hopes nobody finds out.
Yeah. I am. If you had asked me 3 days ago, I probably would have said that's what's going on. But as I was thinking about it, I'm not sure that's what's going on. But if you open up commentaries on Exodus, probably half of them will mention.
It's just a huge leap.
And I bring it up for that, but I do think it is a leap, which is why I bring it up so you're aware of that point of view. But I do think it's a bit of a leap there. Anyways, Moses runs to go and he flees off to Midian. Who is Midian, or Midianites? Why are they important? Who do they descend from? Abraham. Who didn't descend from Abraham in the book of Genesis? Let's like Genesis 12:1, you're all related to Abraham. They are the offspring of Abraham's relationship with Keturah. So when Sarah dies and he remarries, if I remember correctly, they are the offspring or the result of that marriage. And so here you have Moses raised in the family of promise. When he is forced to flee Egypt, he runs away to his distant family, the Midianites, his half-cousins, or whatever way you want to phrase it. And so he spends his life, a portion of his life, in exile. And in many ways, Moses is somewhat like some of the patriarchs that we talked about in Genesis. Think about Jacob, who spent a portion of his life away from his family and his friends because of things that he did. Now, once again, we are seeing Moses away from his family and his friends because of things that he did. Some of these themes are going to repeat themselves over and over and over again. Like so many of the patriarchs, Moses lives, as he says there in verse 22, as an alien in a foreign land. And so while he's there, he lives as a shepherd, which is a common theme for leaders of God's people. Think about David. David served as a shepherd. Moses served as a shepherd. And he lives with this priest of Midian and serves as a shepherd for him during that time frame. One of the things, this is interesting, I think at least, that we see two people who are not part of the family of promise called priests of God, or priests, and the implication is priest of God when we look further in the story, who are not part of the family of promise. Who are those two people? Going all the way back to Abraham's life. He's got a funny name. Melchizedek. And Abraham's father-in-law. Both are priests and called priests of God before there was a priesthood established under the Levitical law. That's interesting to me. Anyway, so he spends time with this priest of Midian who had a couple of daughters. He marries one of the daughters. He's a shepherd for this priest. And so he's working for his father-in-law. We've seen that story before. And so he marries Zipporah. They give birth to a son named Gershom because he's been a resident alien in a foreign land. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. And pay attention to the verbs here. And Israel groaned because of their difficult labor. That's that word again. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. So the question I want us to kind of think about for a few moments is that was bad grammar, what does Exodus 2, 23 through 25 teach us about God? What does Exodus 2, 23 through 25 teach us about God?
He listens to us.
He listens to us, yeah. That's spot on. He listens to us. Does anything else about what's going on there in 23 through 25 jump out to you?
God doesn't forget his promise.
God doesn't forget his promises. So he listens to us. He doesn't forget his promises. Who is Israel crying out to? Does it explicitly tell us they're crying out? No, it doesn't. That even though, yes, Israel is crying out, but the text doesn't tell us they're crying out to God. In fact, I think if we read the story a little bit further, we kind of start to see that Israel's relationship with God, even though they're the people of promise, may not be what it's supposed to be. And so they're crying out, this is difficult, this is hard, this isn't supposed to be this way, this is unjust, whatever they're crying out. But they're not crying out to God. And still God hears their cry. And he remembers his promises. And God acts. And that's really what the rest of the book of Exodus is all about. God working to act on those promises. Yeah.
I want to go back to that thing about the priest's idea. And
Yeah.
about how we have Moses' father-in-law and we
Yeah.
have Melchizedek. When, in Genesis, when God is talking to Abimelech, he says, Abraham's my prophet.
Yeah.
And so we see like the definition of what a prophet is outside of the Levitical system.
Yeah.
But we don't really have a definition of what a priest is outside of the Levitical system.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's correct that a prophet is meant to be a spokesperson for God for outside people, and a priest is meant to be a prophet for God for their own people? Like, what's a priest outside? It's not sacrifices, probably. So what does a priest do outside
Okay.
of the Levitical system?
So the way I would think of it is that a prophet, would be the one speaking the words of God. I think that's a great, I think you use that word. I think that's a spot on definition of the role and job of a prophet. The work of a priest is to intercede or to offer sacrifices or lead someone in worship on their behalf. And so Melchizedek worships or leads people in worship or intercedes on behalf of someone else. The priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, is a leader of worship, intercedes for people on their behalf. That's what a priest does. In fact, in Exodus 19, if we skip ahead in our minds, Israel's called a kingdom of priests. And so what we see is Melchizedek's a priest, Moses' father-in-law is a priest, Israel's a priest. It's only after Israel is established as a kingdom of priests that the Levitical system is pointed. And that goes back to something I think Chris said at the beginning of class, that Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations and represent God to the world, to intercede for the world to God, kind of serve as an in-between. That could kind of see the idea there. But they completely bomb at that. They completely bomb at their responsibility to stand in the gap between a wicked world, a pagan world, and a loving, graceful, but also judgmental God. And they mess that up. And so, if you want to summarize, when you look at the Genesis Exodus account that we're reading and we're halfway through, prophet speaks the word of God, priest intercedes for God, or intercedes for the people before God. That's the way I would kind of define it. I saw you shaking your heads, Chris.
No, I'm shaking my head. I'm just thinking about the question. So I'm not sure I understand. So your question is a prophet for those outside of the Levitical system? Is that?
Well, it's interesting to me that God calls Abraham a prophet. He doesn't use the word priest.
Yeah.
He declares him a prophet. And then we see that there's two men in the Bible who are referred to as priests, but like, are they God appointed? Are they self-named? Like, where do we get this idea of what a priest is?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering, like, did they get their authority from God to be priests, or were they just the religious leaders of their group?
I don't know on who gave them their authority. I'm not sure if the text actually tells us who told Moses' father-in-law, okay, you can serve as a priest of God Most High, or Melchizedek, you can serve as a priest of God Most High.
Well, Melchizedek, God kind of confirms it. I mean, in the way that he refers to it. He calls Jesus prophet, priest, and king.
Yeah.
And he said they killed the prophets before you because they proclaimed the word of God. So the prophets were proclaiming the word. The priests themselves, like, I've got to believe that if God is going to refer to them as a priest of God, that there's some level of intercession that's taking place. The thing is, that's where you've really got to see those variations, but then understand that he's following a thread.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah. So I think you bring up a good point there, Chris. That somewhere they've got to be confirmed as a priest, but how specifically Moses' father-in-law was confirmed as a priest, I don't know, because the text doesn't tell us. So far as I know, the text does not tell us explicitly how Moses' father-in-law was confirmed as a priest, or how that worked outside of the Levitical system. Like, I mean, we see Abraham, all the patriarchs offering sacrifices under every tree, pretty much, to God. But they're not called priests, and so it's an interesting kind of story and thread to kind of
I mean,
follow.
Molech had priests. They had priests for Molech.
Yeah, priests.
So
Yeah,
priests that were sacrificing children. That's one of the things in Leviticus. He's like, don't do that.
yeah. And there's some reasons for that. We'll get to that when we get to Leviticus. Does that answer your question in any way?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a wondering, but it
Yeah.
just seems like I object to religious groups now that put priests in between us and God.
Yeah.
As like, who gave you the authority to intercede between me and God? Like, God's been clear about it's Jesus or nobody, right? And so it's curious to me that there's like these priests running around that have intercessory jobs.
Yeah, and I think the priests in the Old Testament, I think Hebrews really kind of brings this out. The priesthood of the Old Testament anticipate the priesthood of Christ in the New Testament. Like, if you look ahead and look at Hebrews, the Hebrew writer really draws that out. in the middle of the book about how Jesus is our great high priest and the role he plays interceding for us. And so that's why we don't need a priest. That's why we don't need priest, Chris or priest Steve or priest Ray or priest Steve interceding for us, because we have a greater high priest.
Well, I think the covenant makes a difference too.
Yeah.
I think the patriarchal covenant is by its very nature pretty loose.
Yeah.
And then it narrows with the Abrahamic covenant, and then even more so through Christ.
Yeah.
So that each of those covenants carries with it certain implications. The people of the world still had an obligation under the patriarchal covenant to live as God designed it, even as he's showing his glory, or trying to show his glory, through the Israelites.
Yeah, yeah. And that's and some of that ties into with what Romans 1 talks about. Romans 1, 18 through 32 or something like that. Anyways, does that kind of help answer? And so hopefully it does. Did I see any other hands come up with questions?
I don't have a
Yes.
question, but it's just a wonder. I'm always intrigued and drawn to genealogies and all
Mhm.
that, and just curious in here. Did you say 400 years between after Joseph,
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
roughly? So would that be 4 generations? Just wondering, because how is that? I'm looking at Jesus' genealogy, and I know we stop at Tamar with Perez.
Mm-hmm.
And then we know that the Israelites, it feels like they had no leader, or they've lost that connection. I don't know what happened, right? The Bible doesn't say.
Yeah.
But yet they're growing. And I always find it interesting how, before the generations, if you don't teach your children about God, they forget about God, right? So I guess that's what happened here. I mean, I guess Jacob was the last one, the last patriarch, and I don't know what happened after that, or maybe Judah became someone and taught, but who else was teaching them about God during that period? And then I just go back to the genealogy of Christ during that time.
Yeah.
Is that somewhere here in Matthew? I'm just trying
Yeah.
to see who, I don't know. I don't know if I even make sense, but I'm just wondering how, tracing that genealogy through those 400 years.
Well, pre-Moses, I think there's definitely an oral tradition pre-Moses that shared sort of, here's where you come from.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's how you come from. They knew they knew that what does he say about Moses right there from Levi? Doesn't say Moses of this, Moses of that. It goes all the way back to Levi.
Right.
Mhm.
When it references Moses. So they were
Sure.
taught that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Like if you look ahead to Matthew chapter 1,
Right.
you start in verse 3, Matthew 1 verse 3. They're around, Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Aram, so on and so forth. There's several generations that could make up some of those in that 400 years of silence. But as Chris has pointed out, there's this oral tradition, or it was written down, whatever it was, to make sure the genealogy remained intact. And we know that because when God gave the covenant and he dictated Levites serve as priests, what does that tell us? They had to have some record of who was from Levi. And we look a little farther in the history, and we know that Saul was from Benjamin. And so Benjamin, they had to have a record to trace Saul's family all the way back to Benjamin. And likewise, David to Judah. Yeah, Lisa?
I was just looking that up, and the genealogies are intact but not complete.
Yeah.
Right.
They aren't all the generations.
Yeah.
They're just the highlights.
Yes.
So like the way that they know it's 400 years is because God says
Yeah.
they were there for 400
Yeah.
years, not because of the genealogical breakdown.
Yeah. Like you look ahead, I think it's the 1 Kings 6 and verse 1 is where it says it had been 480 years, and so that's Solomon. So 480 years before Solomon is when they were in Egypt, when the Exodus happened. And so you can do a little bit of math based on all this and what we see in the New Testament, put some pieces together to kind of understand, hey, this is 400 years. and to help with the timeline a little bit, because as Lisa's rightfully pointed out, it doesn't seem like when we look at the genealogical list, it's literal Carrie begot Austin. Carrie's my dad, by the way. Carrie begot Austin, who begot Jackson, whoever Jackson has, 25 years from now. So on and so forth.
But that becomes, the genealogy becomes very important, not only now, but that's the whole point of the destruction of Jerusalem in
Yeah.
70 AD.
Yeah.
Is it completely destroyed the genealogical records. There is no way to today have an accurate accounting of how to be making sure you have a Levitical priest, even if Jews under this law were still sacrificing. There's no way to go into the Holy of Holies. There's no way to do the things that you would need to do to be a Jew today.
Yeah.
It's just impossible. It's impossible.
Yeah. So.
And yet they continue believing so.
Yeah, I've got a funny story which I will not tell on a live studio audience that involves Professor FC and a friend of mine. Anyway, so really quickly, as we kind of conclude our class really quickly tonight, how does Exodus 1 and 2 set up the rest of Exodus? Like, what goes on here in the text in Exodus 1 that kind of helps us understand it? I'm willing to assume most of us maybe kind of understand the story, remember the story, or we've heard about the story, we've seen the movie with Christian Bale, Exodus, God and Kings, and so we kind of know what's coming. How does Exodus 1 and 2 kind of set that up? Yeah.
Well, I haven't read the rest of Exodus, but it sounds like it sets the stage. It sets it creates a setting, creates the characters, and it creates a moral question
Yeah.
for the characters to
I
grapple.
like the way you phrase it. Lets us know the world, the setting, the context, the characters. It's setting the stage for something else, and really the moral question. If I didn't know you had a chemistry degree, I would say you were illiterate because of the way you broke it down. But you're right; it's a moral question. Who is Israel going to serve? What's going to happen with these people who are suffering this great injustice, who are being oppressed and afflicted by Pharaoh in Egypt? That's what the rest of the book is going to answer. And so we'll dig into Exodus 3 and 4, I think it is next Wednesday night. We're also going to start our new class, God Is, on Sunday. Any final comments, questions, thoughts? Okay, we'll pick it up on Wednesday.
So I have a question. As I went through all of this.
Middle Earth, did I hear?
Okay.